in the stillness of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, where the air is crisp and the trees whisper in the wind, there once stood a quiet little cabin. It looked ordinary, peaceful, even idyllic. But deep beneath that modest roof, hidden behind false walls and buried secrets, was a place few dared imagine. A dungeon, a prison, a theater of cruelty and control, built by two men who didn't just commit murder, they rehearsed it. This is the horrifying true story of Charles N.G. and Leonard Lake, a pair of sadistic killers who constructed their own private hell and filmed the suffering of those trapped inside it.
Leonard Lake was born in 1945 in San Francisco, California. His childhood wasn't marked by poverty or chaos, but something much quieter, something more insidious. Leonard's parents separated early. He was passed between relatives, often staying with his grandmother. She doted on him, gave him too much freedom. And with that freedom, Leonard started to reveal who he really was. At the age of 6, he began photographing his sisters while they bathed, not out of curiosity, but out of control. He was obsessed with domination, even then. Later, he'd kill small animals and calmly watch them die. People saw the warning signs, but no one stepped in.
As he got older, Lake became a survivalist, obsessed with end-of-the-world fantasies. He believed nuclear war was inevitable. He read dystopian fiction, especially a novel called The Collector, the story of a man who kidnaps a woman and traps her in a basement, believing she'll eventually love him. That book didn't disturb Leonard Lake. It inspired him. He began writing in journals, sketching plans, a personal bunker, weapons, food stores, and women. In Lake's twisted mind, the apocalypse would be his chance to rebuild the world in his image, with women enslaved to serve him.
In 1965, Lake joined the United States Marine Corps. He served in Vietnam, but his time there only fed his paranoia. Lake would later claim he suffered from PTSD, but those who knew him say he already had something wrong long before war touched him. While deployed, he became fascinated with chemical weapons, underground bunkers, and prisoner tactics. After returning home, Lake's life began to unravel. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, though some psychologists believed he was faking it to avoid punishment. Regardless, the diagnosis only isolated him further. Now out of the military and increasingly detached from reality, Leonard moved into a commune in Northern California. It was here he began recording his thoughts on tape, fantasies of capturing women, of creating a world where he ruled with absolute power. He even had a name for it – Operation Miranda.
While Lake was building bunkers in his mind, across the Pacific, another monster was forming. Charles Un was born in 1960 in Hong Kong. His father was a wealthy businessman, strict, distant, and abusive. Charles was the youngest of 3 and never quite fit in. From a young age, N showed antisocial behavior. He shoplifted, lied, was expelled from multiple schools. His father sent him to boarding school in England. That didn't help. Eventually, fled to the United States and joined the Marines, using fake documents. But even in the military, he couldn't stay out of trouble. Was caught stealing heavy weaponry, grenades, machine guns from a Marine base. Arrested and imprisoned, he was dishonorably discharged. But he didn't disappear, because in prison, he met Leonard Lake.
Their connection was instant. Leonard Lake, the older, manipulative ideologue. Charles Ng, the unstable, violent follower. Both men shared fantasies of power, control, and pain. Both hated society, women, and weakness. Lake took Ng under his wing. Together, they started stockpiling weapons, recording training videos, testing out traps and chemical disposal methods. They called themselves survivalists, patriots, visionaries. But the truth was simpler. They were predators, and they were preparing their hunting ground.
In the early 1980s, Lake purchased a secluded cabin in Wilseyville, California. The perfect place. No neighbors, no questions. Beneath that cabin, he dug out a small bunker, soundproofed, hidden. There were multiple rooms, a sleeping area, a torture chamber, and a filming setup. Ng helped install steel-reinforced doors, chains, recording equipment. On the walls, they placed signs with phrases like, "Obedience is freedom." This wasn't just a place to kill. It was a stage, a place where Lake could live out his fantasy and Ng could do the dirty work.
No one knows exactly who the first victim was. It may have been a drifter, a woman looking for work, or perhaps a friend lured by trust, then betrayed. But soon the killings became frequent. Lake and NG would place ads in survivalist magazines, pretending to sell equipment. When someone answered, they were invited to the cabin. Some were entire families, a husband, a wife, a baby. Lake would shoot the men, then force the women into his dungeon. He filmed everything, mocking them, torturing them, calling it re-education. NG would often take the lead in physical abuse, grinning, laughing. In one recovered tape, Lake calmly tells a crying woman, "You can cooperate and survive a little longer." She didn't survive.
Over the next year, more people disappeared. Some neighbors noticed strange noises, visitors who never left. But Wilseyville was remote, and Leonard Lake knew how to lie. They buried the bodies in shallow graves, dissolved others in acid, kept souvenirs, jewelry, photos, ID cards. By the time police caught on, more than a dozen people were already gone. And the worst was still to come. We'll follow the investigation that cracked the case wide open, the mistake that brought the killers down, the discovery of the tapes,
and what really happened in the death dungeon of Wilseyville.
The summer of 1985 was winding down, but for one man, it would end in tragedy and the unraveling of a terrifying secret. A woman named Carolyn Hartzell disappeared without a trace from her apartment in Walnut Creek, California. But this was only the beginning.
Carolyn was a young woman who had answered an ad for survivalist gear. She thought she was meeting a legitimate seller, but the man she met was Charles Ng, Leonard Lake's loyal accomplice. Carolyn vanished. Days later, her family filed a missing persons report. Police began to dig. What they found soon connected Carolyn's disappearance to a string of other vanishings, all linked to a man known as Leonard Lake.
But Lake was clever. He avoided contact with the outside world. Meanwhile, Ng was in trouble, and the police were closing in on him. Ng was arrested in Canada after attempting to cross the border illegally, carrying a stolen handgun. At first, Ng refused to talk, but pressure mounted. Authorities began to connect the dots, linking him to the missing women, to Lake, and to a remote cabin in California.
Police approached the cabin with caution. It was secluded, surrounded by dense forest, miles from the nearest road. They found the front door locked, the windows dark. Inside, the horror was unlike anything officers had seen. A bunker hidden beneath the cabin floor, soundproof and fortified. Steel chains, restraints, and crude torture devices filled the rooms. And in the corner, reels of videotape, Lake's recordings of the unimaginable. The tapes showed abductions, torture, and murder, all staged like a macabre film. Victims pleading, crying, begging for mercy. Lake's cold voice issuing commands. NG's cruel laughter echoing through the speakers. Police officers described feeling sick as they watched. One officer later said, "It was like stepping into a nightmare you could never wake from."
The evidence found at the Wilseyville site was overwhelming. DNA, personal effects, and the videotapes, all pointing to the monstrous crimes of Lake and NG. But Leonard Lake never stood trial. In custody, he took his own life with cyanide. Charles NG, however, faced justice. After years of legal battles, he was convicted on multiple counts of murder. Sentenced to death, NG remains on death row in California, a chilling reminder of the darkness that once hid beneath the forest floor. We will explore the disturbing psychological profiles of these killers, delve deeper into the personal stories of the victims, and reveal how their lives were tragically cut short. Stay tuned for the final chapter in this grim tale.
To understand the horrors of Wilseyville, we must first peer into the minds of its architects, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. What twisted paths led these men to become predators of the most chilling kind? And who were the souls caught in their deadly web? This is the story of shattered lives, the victims behind the headlines,
and the dark psychology of two killers who found deadly companionship in one another. Leonard Lake was born in 1945, raised in a troubled household. A quiet boy on the surface, but behind closed doors, he harbored violent fantasies. Experts say Lake's childhood was marked by early signs of cruelty and fascination with control. His journals revealed disturbing obsessions, torture, domination, and a delusional vision of creating a utopia by capturing and controlling women. He believed that by controlling others completely, he could escape the failures of his own life. Lake's paranoia grew, leading him to build the infamous bunker, a prison of pain and terror. But he could not have done it alone.
Charles Eng, born in Hong Kong, had a troubled youth of his own. Some who knew him described a shy, intelligent young man, but also one with a dark undercurrent. He was drawn to Lake's world, a world where cruelty and violence were power. Eng was complicit in unimaginable acts, not just following orders, but actively participating in torture, rape, and murder. Psychological experts who later studied Eng describe him as lacking empathy, prone to manipulation, and terrifyingly methodical. Together, they were a deadly duo, each feeding the other's darkest impulses.
Behind every statistic was a person with dreams, hopes, and fears. Victims like Carolyn Hartzell, who had answered what seemed like a harmless ad for survival equipment, only to vanish forever. Christine Stahl, a young woman whose laughter once filled rooms, now silenced by cruelty. Susan Curtis and others, each abducted, held captive, and subjected to unspeakable horrors in the bunker beneath the cabin. Their families would never get answers, only the haunting legacy left behind in police reports and grim videotapes.
Among the darkest discoveries were the videotapes, recorded by Lake as if his crimes were a film. These tapes documented the capture, abuse, and eventual deaths of the victims. Hearing their pleas for mercy, seeing their pain, broke the spirits of the officers who watched. The tapes exposed not just the physical torment, but the psychological terror inflicted by Lake and NG. They were cold, methodical, a grotesque theater of cruelty, and a chilling insight into the twisted minds behind the deaths.
Leonard Lake's story ended with his suicide in custody, refusing to face trial for his crimes. Charles Ing fought for years in the courts, but was eventually convicted and sentenced to death. Yet even with justice served, the scars remain for families, survivors, and the community forever changed by their actions. This case reminds us of the darkness lurking beneath ordinary facades and the importance of vigilance and compassion. As we close this chapter, we remember those lost, their stories echoing as a warning and a plea for empathy in a world that can sometimes be cruel.
In the final part, we will uncover the chilling trial of Charles N.G., the lasting legacy of this horrific case, and the lessons learned from one of America's most disturbing serial killer duos. Stay with us.
The nightmare in the Sierra Nevada foothills had ended. But for the survivors, the families, and the law enforcement who uncovered the horrors, the true reckoning was just beginning. What followed was a years-long battle for justice, a trial haunted by silence, denial, and the unbearable weight of what had been done.
After Leonard Lake's suicide in 1985, Charles Ng became the sole surviving architect of the death dungeon. But justice was far from swift. Ng had fled to Canada before his arrest, and the legal battle to extradite him dragged on for nearly 6 years. He fought tooth and nail to avoid returning to the United States, claiming he wouldn't receive a fair trial, especially in a country with the death penalty. But in 1991, Ng was finally brought back to California to stand trial. By then, the memory of the Wilseyville horrors had not faded. If anything, the public demand for justice had only intensified.
The state of California prepared for what would become the most expensive criminal trial in the state's history. Over $20 million in cost. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The videotapes, eyewitness accounts, physical items from victims, and Ng's own writings. Still, Ng pled not guilty. He claimed Lake was the true killer, that he had been manipulated, that he didn't commit the murders. But the tapes told another story. Ng was seen participating, laughing, taunting victims, tying them down. There was no denying his role.
The trial dragged on for 8 grueling months. Jurors watched hours of footage, some so disturbing they needed counseling. Testimony from families added emotional weight. In 1999, the verdict finally came. Charles Ng was found guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison. To this day, he remains there, awaiting execution, and though decades have passed, no execution date has been set. The legal outcome brought some measure of closure, but no trial could undo what had been done. Families were shattered. Many never recovered from the loss of their loved ones. Investigators, too, carried the trauma of what they had uncovered in that bunker. One officer described it as a place where humanity had been completely erased. The tapes, the chains, the quiet woods surrounding it all remained burned into their memories. Survivors and relatives formed support groups, memorialized the victims, and tried to rebuild their lives. But the scars, both visible and unseen, never truly faded.
In the years since, true crime shows, documentaries, and books have revisited the Wilseyville case. But the victims are often lost in the noise. They weren't just victims. They were parents, sisters, sons, friends. Their voices were silenced, but they deserve to be remembered. And if there's one lesson to be taken from this tragedy, it's this. The most dangerous evil often hides behind ordinary smiles. The world may never fully understand what drove N and Lake to such depravity, but we must never forget the people they hurt and the community that came together to seek justice.
The story of Charles Ng and Leonard Lake is a reminder that monsters can live next door, that trust can be exploited, and that some crimes leave echoes that last for generations.
Thank you for staying with us through this journey into darkness. Like and subscribe if this story moved you. And remember, speak up for the silent. Keep their names alive.